Drip. Kahit sino po mag-share.
videos every
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us today. On behalf of all the members of ACTRC and Surge, I'd like to welcome you all today to the first synchronous session of the Professional Development Program, Building Assessment Competence of Teachers. I am Julian de la Cruz, a research officer at the Assessment, Curriculum, and Technology Research Center, or ACTRC, and I will be your host for this afternoon.
I am Louis Cagasan, one of your hosts for today's session and also a research officer at ACRC. ACRC is a partnership between two universities, the University of the Philippines and the University of Melbourne. Right now, we are under the UPC Center for Integrative and Development Studies, or UPCIDS, in UP Diliman.
This PG program has 6 sessions that talk about different assessment processes. This afternoon, our main agenda is to provide with you a summary of Session 1, its highlights and important considerations, and try to process your reflections from the initial batch of responses that we have gathered. Remember that we asked you to answer some reflection questions right after accomplishing the Qualtrics form.
But before we get to business, let me first acknowledge the people attending this session today. First in line are our dear teachers from different regions in the country, and of course, our partners from the Sustaining Education Reform Gains Surge Project. We would also like to take the opportunity to give our special thanks to Save the Children Philippines, the Department of Education, the National Educators Academy of the Philippines, the Australian Government TFAT, UPCIDS, and UP Integrated School. Thank you very much for the support.
And now, before we proceed to the discussion on the first session, let's listen to a short message from the Australian Ambassador to the Philippines, His Excellency Stephen J. Robinson, AO.
Good day to all of you, our fine teachers. It is a privilege to speak to you today and commend you for being part of this online professional development opportunity. Your work is so important to the future of your country because education is key. It is one of the foundations of society. And how well you educate children will have an impact on the future of this country. Australia has been involved with the education sector in the Philippines for several decades now because we want to see a strong, prosperous, educated Philippines. I am pleased that Australia supports DepEd on teacher professional development and curriculum enhancement through partners like Assessment, Curriculum and Technology Research Centre, or ACT-RC, an organisation born from Filipino-Australian collaboration and shared expertise. I hope you find this training delivered by ACT-RC in collaboration with the Department of Education's National Educators Academy of the Philippines useful in further developing the reading, math and science literacy of your students. As you are aware, this training is part of a series of professional development activities on student learning assessments and emerging literacies. It is closely aligned with the focus of the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, which the Philippines participated in for the first time in 2018. I am glad to note that this program aims to support you in responding to the evolving needs of your students for relevant and updated knowledge and skills, an area of particular interest to Australia. I would like to briefly acknowledge ACT-RC, specialists from the University of the Philippines and the University of Melbourne. Education has gone from strength to strength over the last 3 decades. Australia and the Philippines are also long-standing partners. Last year, in 2021, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the diplomatic relationship between Australia and the Philippines. On a personal level, let me share with you that supporting teachers is something very close to my heart. I was a teacher myself, and so were several of the staff members at the embassy before we pursued careers in diplomacy. So I am intimately familiar with some of the challenges of your work and the importance of what you do. The pandemic has made your jobs much more challenging, and we appreciate your continued perseverance, innovation, and resilience in facilitating learning for millions of Filipino children across different modalities. Our children's education right now is one of the most important investments we have for the future. Education is a fundamental aspect of development, both to an individual and to a society. Australia, as a reliable friend and a good neighbour to the Philippines, will support you in whatever way we can. In closing, I would like to leave you with a line from Joseph Joubert. To teach is to learn twice. I hope you will not get tired of teaching, because that also means you will continue to learn. So thank you for your love of learning. I wish you all the very best as you continue with your quest for education quality through these trainings. Congratulations to all of you. Mabuhay.
Thank you, Ambassador Robinson. Louis?
Let's now begin our discussion on session 1. To clear any of our confusions regarding assessment purposes, our speaker will be talking about distinctions between them and discuss your responses to the reflection questions. So while the speaker is delivering his presentation, you may type in your questions or comments in the comments box. They will be answered later in the session. May we request the participants to kindly utilize the comment section only for raising your questions or concerns.
So again, you may type in your questions in the comments box. So our speaker for today is Dr. Kevin Carl Santos, a Senior Research Fellow at the Assessment, Curriculum and Technology Research Center. He is an Associate Professor at the Educational Research and Evaluation area of the College of Education in the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He finished his PhD in Statistics in the same university last 2018. He was a visiting research scholar at the Graduate School of Education in Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey in 2015 to 2016, and a postdoctoral fellow in cognitive diagnosis modeling at the Faculty of Education, the University of Hong Kong in 2018 to 2019. His research interests include item response theory, cognitive diagnosis modeling, sampling design, and analysis of large-scale educational assessment data. Dear teachers, let's welcome Teacher Kevin to give the highlights of Session 1, Assessment Purposes.
Good afternoon, dear teachers. Thank you for spending your time this Friday afternoon with us. So again, welcome to our assessment professional development program on building basic assessment competence of teachers. So for today, we will talk about summary highlights, and we will also present another example for session 1, which is about assessment and its purposes. So in session 1, these are the 3 essential questions that we attempted to answer by watching the lecture videos. So first is, what is the role of assessment in teaching learning process? What are the 2 main purposes of assessment? And the third one is, what is the difference between formal and informal formative assessments? So before proceeding with the succeeding slides, let me just share with you this particular quote from Lord Kelvin. To measure is to know. If you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. This particular quotation actually applies on our topic for session 1, which is about assessment. So the question here on the left side states that if the ultimate goal of education is for learners to learn, how do we know that they're indeed learning? So meaning we have to do something about it by measuring it so that we can improve that. So in session one, we said that assessment is closely intertwined with curriculum and instruction. You cannot talk about assessment without referring to the curriculum and of course the classroom instruction. In Depth Ed Order number 8, series 2015, classroom assessment is described as an ongoing process of first identifying, gathering, organizing, and interpreting quantitative and qualitative information about what learners know and what they can also do. I know that since you're already teaching for probably for several school years already, you've come across different types of assessments. But here in this session, we are going to classify assessments based on its purpose. So there are two types of assessments based on their purposes. So first one is what we call the formative assessment, and the second one is the summative assessment. Formative assessment refers to all activities undertaken by teachers and or by their students which provide information to be used as feedback to modify teaching and learning activities. So this feedback can also be used to improve classroom instruction or probably to target the weaknesses or to further improve the strength of the students. The other type of assessment is the summative assessment. So the summative purpose of the assessment is to judge what the learner had achieved at the end of a course or a program. So for example, it could be a particular examination, quarterly examination, or an examination given at the end of the school year. So this table actually summarizes the differences between formative assessments and summative assessments. So these are, for formative assessment, we can use these assessments to identify the gap between the current and desired learner competence, to adapt for learner needs, to provide feedback, to improve instruction, and also to engage students in the assessment and learning process. On the other hand, for summative assessments, these assessments are used for grading, for ranking the students, for reporting, or even for promoting them, let's say, to the next grade level, or as well as certifying them. So the question now is, are these two types of assessment mutually exclusive? Meaning, do they overlap? This slide actually answers that question. So can assessment strategies or evidence be used for both formative and summative purposes? So according to Black and William, they said that the same assessment instrument and indeed the same assessment outcomes can be used both summatively and formatively. So basically, it depends on your purpose. So for example, a particular assessment can be used, let's say, to provide feedback to the learners, and you can also use it for grading purposes. So in that case, you can use that particular assessment instrument or assessment outcomes both summatively and formatively. Summative assessments can provide information that teachers can use to inform teaching and learning decisions for subsequent lessons. Meaning, you just not use summative assessments only for grading or for reporting, but you also use that particular information to inform your classroom instruction or teaching and learning decisions for the next lessons. So that's also a case wherein you can use summative assessment for formative purposes. It is important that these assessment outcomes, like test scores and identified areas for improvement, are constructively fed back to learners, of course, with plans for improvement. So this one is an example, particularly for grade 2 reading, but the assessment strategies that are being cited here or used in this particular scenarios can be used in any grade level or in other learning areas as well. So let me read this particular scenario to you. Teacher John teaches grade 2 reading. They will be reading Archibald by Eve Tarlet for the current topic on responding to a text read. Now, the following describes the flow of the lesson the teacher John plans to do. First, teacher John guides the learners in unlocking unfamiliar words through picture and context clues. So she does this to help prepare learners in reading the text. Then she asks a motivation question. Through this and the unlocking of unfamiliar words, she can check the learner's prior knowledge and make on the spot changes in the lesson as needed. Now, the motivation question also helps the learners relate their prior knowledge and experiences to the text, thereby facilitating better understanding of the story. So let's have an example of a motivation question. So, have you ever wondered what your neighbors think about you? How do you think will they describe you? So these two questions can be used by Teacher John for his class together with the unlocking of unfamiliar words. After that, she presents what we call the motive question and the comprehension questions. These questions will guide the learners as they read the text and will be answered after reading. So, just a brief difference between the motivation question and the motive question. So, a motivation question helps activate learners' prior knowledge related to, but not necessarily about the story. On the other hand, a motive question is a question similar to the motivation question that touches on the story. So, for example, of a motive question, what do the people in his neighborhood think about our main character? So, this particular question touches on the story of the book that was mentioned earlier. So, after reading, Teacher John starts a discussion. She goes back to the motive and the comprehension questions to check what and how much the learners have understood about the story. So she listens closely to the learners' responses so she can clarify and correct misconceptions or give examples. Based on their discussion, she decides that the learners are ready to do the engagement activity. So what she did is she divides the class into 5 groups. A task meant to engage the learners in further understanding the lesson is assigned to each group. Each group reports their output to the class, and the other groups are allowed to ask questions and share their comments. Learners' outputs are collected, and their comments and questions are noted by Teacher John. This will be returned to them the next meeting in order for the learners to know how they are keeping up with the lessons. And this task will not be graded. Following the group presentation is a graded quiz. So Teacher John collects their papers so she can take a look at their scores and answers. Now, the results of their quiz and their group output will be used in determining what should be improved in the next lesson. So that ends the particular scenario of Teacher John for grade 2 reading. Now, let's try to analyze this scenario by classifying the assessment strategies that Teacher John used in this lesson, in her lesson. So this table summarizes the different assessment strategies that were mentioned earlier. So if you can still recall, the first one is unlocking of unfamiliar words through the picture and context clues. Then it was followed by motivation question, discussion of motive questions and comprehension questions, group task, and finally, the quiz. Now, as you can see in the second column, we specify the specific purpose of the assessment strategy. Now, recall that we are classifying the assessment methods into two which is formative and summative based on its purpose. So we list down the specific purpose of each assessment method so that it will help us to identifying whether that particular assessment strategy or method is classified as formative or summative. So for the first one, unlocking of unfamiliar words through picture and context clues, the purpose of doing this assessment strategy is to check the learner's prior knowledge and make on-the-spot changes in the lesson. So here we are identifying the learning gaps and improving classroom instruction. Hence, it is classified as a formative assessment. The second one is motivation question. So its purpose is to check learners' prior knowledge and make on-the-spot changes in the lesson as well. So here we are identifying learning gaps. Its purpose also is to relate prior knowledge and experiences to the text. So here we are bridging learning gaps. So because of these specific purposes, it's also classified as a formative assessment. For the third one, discussion of motive questions and comprehension questions, its purpose is to check comprehension, correct learners' misconception, and to give more examples. So hence, we are doing, Teacher John does the discussion of motive questions and comprehension questions to identify learning gaps and to provide feedback as well. Hence, it's also classified as a formative assessment. The next one is the group task. So the goal of Teacher John is to engage learners in further understanding the lesson, assess other groups' output, and it is not graded, as mentioned earlier. So here Teacher John is engaging the learners in learning and assessment process. Hence, it's also classified as a formative assessment. Now, the last assessment method is the quiz. As mentioned, it will be graded and therefore it will be used for grading. But aside from that, it will be a basis for instructional decision making, which is being used to plan for the subsequent lessons. And therefore, it is being used to improve classroom instruction. So for the first specific purpose mentioned here, it is classified as a formative assessment. But as mentioned earlier, a particular assessment method can be used formatively and summatively. Since the quiz is being graded or will be used for grading, it's also classified as a summative assessment. So to sum it up, the quiz is both a formative and a summative assessment in this particular scenario. Okay. Now, here are some other examples of formative assessment. So like in-class discussions, clicker questions, group work, weekly quizzes, 1-minute reflection writing assignments, a short survey, journals, and diagnostic test. Take note that again, when we have assessment strategy, you have to go back to its purpose. What is the purpose of doing this as particular assessment? So for these 8 examples, the purpose is to track learning of the students and to improve classroom instruction as well. And therefore, they are classified as formative assessments. Now, typically, examples of summative assessments are instructor-created exams like quarterly exams, standardized tests, final projects, final essays, final presentations, or final reports and paper. Because typically their purpose is to evaluate student learning and or to rank students at the end of an instructional unit like a quarter, semester, or a school year. Now, this table summarizes the differences between formative and summative assessment based on 3 aspects. So regarding purpose of the assessment, so for formative assessment, we are using it to improve instruction and student learning outcomes, while for summative assessment, we're using it to evaluate student outcomes. For occurrence in the teaching and learning period, for formative assessment, it can happen anytime. It can happen before you start the lecture or the lesson, during the lesson or classroom discussion, or after the lesson. For summative assessment, typically it's toward the end of a period of learning or unit. And lastly, for the role of teacher for formative assessment, the teacher acts as a facilitator of learning. While for summative assessment, the teacher acts as an assessor or an evaluator. Now, let's focus more on formative assessment. There are 3 processes involved in formative assessment. The first one is gathering, second is interpreting, and the third one is acting on information about student learning. There are two types of formative assessments. The first one is what we call the formal formative assessment, and the other one is what we call the informal formative assessment. So what's the difference between the two? So let's describe first the formal formative assessment. So here it is described as a planned act designed to provide evidence about students' learning. So I would like to emphasize the term planned act, so that you can easily classify a formative assessment whether it is a formal formative assessment if it is a planned act designed to provide evidence about student learning. So let's take a look at this table. For this formal formative assessment involves gathering, then interpreting, and then acting. So for gathering, teacher collects or brings together information from a student at the planned time. So for example, you can give quiz or embedded assignment. So it's planned beforehand. Now for interpreting, teacher takes time to analyze information collected from the student. So for example, you provided or you give a quiz or an embedded assignment to your students or learners. Then the next step is to analyze the information collected from the students. So let's say you read student work and provide written comments or feedback to all the students. Then after that, the teacher plans an action to help students achieve learning goals. So it doesn't stop at providing written comments to all students, but you, as a teacher, you should also plan an action to help the students um, achieve the learning goals. So for example, writing or changing the lesson plans to address the state of student learning. So in other words, you adjust the lesson plan, your lesson plan, let's say the following meeting, based on what you've learned from the analysis of the information that you collected from the students. Now, the second type of formative assessment is what we call the informal formative assessment, and it is where evidence of learning is generated in the course of a teacher's day-to-day activities. So here we start with eliciting, followed by recognizing and then using. So under eliciting, teacher brings out or develops information in the form of verbal response from the students. So for example, you can ask students to formulate explanations or to provide evidence. So you can, for example, during the start of the class, you can throw away a particular question. It could be a simple thumbs up or thumbs down activity or question. And then based on their responses, you can do something about it. Okay. So that is a way on eliciting or bringing out information in the form of verbal response from students. So after eliciting, the next one is recognizing. So teacher reacts on the fly by recognizing students' responses and comparing them to accepted scientific ideas. So for example, repeating or revoicing students' responses. And then lastly, using. So teacher immediately makes use of information from the students during the course of ongoing classroom narrative. So example is asking students to elaborate on their responses, explaining learning goals, and promoting argumentation. So a simple example of an informal formative assessment is, let's say you can ask a particular question regarding the lecture in the previous class session. And then based on their answers in that simple recitation, the information that you will get may mean, like, for example, the topic is not yet clear to them. So instead of going to the next topic, what you can do, let's say, is to provide more exercises, or let's say to discuss the lecture again, so that you can address, let's say, the misconception or misunderstanding of the students in the previous lecture. So in other words, you are adjusting your classroom instruction immediately. Not you won't wait for the next session to adjust it. So it's an example of an informal formative assessment and how you can use that particular information. So this slide differentiates informal and formal formative assessment. Okay. Now this is the ESRU model or ESRU model. So it starts with teacher eliciting information. So teacher elicits, student responds, then teacher recognizes, student response, and then teacher uses, student response. And then it's a cycle. So the next, let's say during a particular classroom session or classroom class discussion, this cycle can repeat um, more than once. Okay. Now, this table summarizes the differences between the informal and formal formative assessment. So there are three aspects that they differ. So first is the timing of tasks. For the formal formative assessment, it's identified prior to the lesson proper. So as mentioned, it's a planned act. For informal formative assessment, typically spontaneous. It arises from classroom conversation. As I mentioned earlier, if, for example, you ask a question or you ask your students, let's say, to solve a particular math problem, let's say adding fractions, and based on the responses of the students, it seems that it's not yet clear to them, then you do something about it. So that's why it's typically spontaneous, and it just arises from classroom conversation. Most probably, if you are already doing this, but you just don't know that it's called for informal formative assessment. It's already informal formative assessment. Okay. The next aspect is the timing of modification. So for formal formative assessment, changes are made in subsequent lessons. So you collect the data now, and then you analyze the information or evidence from the students, and then you make adjustment in the subsequent lessons. However, for informal formative assessments, typically you do on the spot adjustments to the lesson. So instead of like sticking on the lesson plan, because based on your informal formative assessment, there are some things that needs to be addressed. So you modify your classroom instruction quite on the spot. You make on the spot adjustment. And the third one is level and structure. So for formal formative assessment, it's a planned structure of events at the class level and considers time and curriculum. Whereas for informal formative assessment, it's student-teacher conversation level, and it gives just-in-time feedback because it's typically spontaneous. You do on-the-spot adjustments to the lessons. Now let's go back to the grade 2 reading example. So there, if you can still recall, there's only one summative assessment there, which is the quiz. However, it's also used as a formative assessment. So these are the 5 assessment methods, formative assessment methods that were cited in our example earlier. So for the unlocking of unfamiliar words through picture and context clues and motivation questions, the rationale behind these 2 formative assessment is this one. Through these activities, though these activities rather are pre-identified in the lesson plan, the teacher meant to use the learner's response as a basis in making immediate changes in the lesson as needed. So if the teacher recognizes that there is a need to modify the lecture or the lesson plan on that particular day, then the teacher has to do something about it. So it's like what we said earlier, on the spot adjustments to the classroom instruction. Therefore, it is classified as an informal formative assessment. For the next one, discussion of motive questions and comprehension questions, if you can still recall the cycle, the ESRU or the SRU cycle, it is evident in this part of the lesson. So the teacher drew student responses by asking the motive and comprehension questions. So that's the part that the teacher elicits and the student responds. Because the teacher was able to make sense of the learner's answer, so meaning that's the recognizing part, she was able to clarify and correct the learner's misconceptions about the lesson or give examples. So it's again an on-the-spot adjustments have been made in the lesson. So that is also an example of an informal formative assessment. Now for the last 2, group task and quiz, the group output and the quiz were collected at a planned time and after the group task and at the end of the lesson. And so meaning it's a planned act, and the results will be used to make improvements in the next lesson. So meaning it's not an on-the-spot adjustment. So the teacher still collects evidence from the student based on the group task and output and the quiz, but that information will be used to adjust the subsequent lectures or lessons. Therefore, it is the group task and the quiz in this particular scenario is considered as a formal formative assessment. So to summarize or to give you an overview of the entire assessment process, and this is what you're going to learn for the entire assessment professional development program. Here we start with assessment planning. So this will be discussed in the next week, assessment planning. After planning the assessment, you collect the evidence, you interpret the assessment evidence, and you use the assessment interpretation. And lastly, you evaluate the assessment process to inform continuous improvement cycles. So just to summarize the key takeaways for this session one, first, assessment plays a vital role in teaching and learning, and it helps diagnose student progress towards learning goals and inform instructional decision. Assessment evidence can either be used for formative and summative purposes or even both. When assessment evidence is used to improve instruction, it is used formatively. And when it is used to evaluate student learning for grading and for or promoting, it is used summatively. Assessment methods and tools also used formatively can be formal or informal depending on three aspects. So we mentioned it depends on the timing of the task, timing of modification, and level and structure. And lastly, assessment is an ongoing process that involves planning, evidence collection, interpretation of assessment evidence, use of assessment interpretation, and evaluation of assessment process to inform continuous improvement cycles. So that ends the summary and highlights and the new example for grade 2 reading. We will briefly would like to thank the following people for their support. Now, we pick some, actually 3 questions from the reflection logs, and we'll try to answer these questions in this session. Okay. So first question is, how do I modify a lesson based on my formative assessment when I'm following a lesson plan? Should I ignore my lesson plan, review my students, or go back to the previous lesson? So I think based on actually our discussion of the example for grade 2 reading, we mentioned that it's good that we have a lesson plan, but sometimes we have to do on-the-spot adjustments on a classroom instruction if the need arises. So, for example, in your lesson plan, it already includes, let's say, a particular formative assessment method. And based on the formative assessment method, on the collected evidence from the student, it appears that there are some concepts in from the previous lecture that are not yet clear to the students. So therefore, if you will just stick to your lesson plan and go with with the plan, then you are leaving some people or some learners behind, because based on your formative assessment, it's saying that there are some learners that are not there are some learners who do not understand yet those particular concepts. So this only means that even if you have a lesson plan, so you have to be flexible about it. Meaning, if there's a need to, let's say, discuss these concepts again, or to give or provide more examples so that the learners will understand these concepts better, then you should be quote unquote ready for that. So you're not actually ignoring your lesson plan, but you're trying to modify it as the need arises. Now, for question 2, is diagnostic assessment still considered as a separate type of assessment? So as I mentioned earlier, there are different types of assessment or tests. Like, for example, you have speed test, power test, you have aptitude tests, etc. So there are different classifications of assessments. But for this particular session, we focused on the types of assessment based on its purpose. So if you have a diagnostic assessment, you have to go back. What is the role or what is the use of this particular assessment? So if you're going to use it, let's say for providing feedback to your students, and let's say to adjust your classroom instruction based on, because sometimes you can use a diagnostic assessment to diagnose what are the things that my learners or students already know. And based on what they already know, you can adjust your classroom instruction. If that's the case, then you are using the diagnostic assessment as a formatively, or as a formative assessment. So again, you have to go back to the purpose of your assessment, and that will determine whether it's a formative or summative assessment. So to answer your question, it depends, because there are different categories of assessment. But for our case, which is differentiating formative and summative assessment, you have to go back to the purpose of the assessment, whether it's a diagnostic assessment or a different type of assessment. And then the last question from the reflection log is, how do we give effective feedback to learners in modular print modality? So this is a question that was often asked in our previous run of the assessment professional development program in the previous months. But just to give you like an overview, because this will be discussed in the succeeding sessions. One way, of course, is to keep in touch with the students. Let's say if it's possible, if they have limited access to internet, you can create, let's say, a Facebook group chat, so that you can, or even text them, or if they have if you can call them, you can call them and ask them, um, and give them feedback and ask them whether what their status is regarding the lecture. Those are the things that can be done if let's say the student prefers a modular print modality. So, but again, regarding the feedback, this will be further discussed in one of the succeeding sessions in this assessment professional development program. Uh, that ends the questions from the reflection logs.
Thank you very much, Teacher Kevin, for that very clear and informative discussion on on assessment purposes. How are you, participants? We hope that you are learning on this topic, and your learning are strengthened by on this program. Now, let's look at some of the questions that you raised just now in the comments box. We would like also to call on our Deputy Director, Dr. Marlene Ferrido, to join us in our question and answer. So we have our first question here. Julie, are you there?
Yes, so let me read our first question. So again, you may type in your questions in the comments box, and our colleagues will send it to us so that it can be answered by our experts here. So the question is, are motivation questions considered formal or informal since it's pre-planned, but you make automatic adjustments according to the response of the students? So any of you, Sir Kevin, Ma'am Marlene, can actually answer the question. Thank you.
Ma'am, Ma'am Marlene, I'll give my answer. I'll try to answer the question. So, I think one of the things that makes a formative assessment different from informal is the the aspect wherein you make on the spot adjustments. So if that's the case, then even if it's pre-planned or it's part of the lesson plan, then it's still considered as an informal formative assessment, because you are making on the spot adjustments in the lecture or in your classroom instruction.
Yeah, I agree with that. But one important thing is not just simply classifying it as formal or informal, but rather appreciating the value of motivation questions, which is, or the purpose, which is really to relate their prior knowledge or what they already know to the lesson or the text that they are trying to learn. So it's not a matter of classifying, although it's important at the backdrop. It's really making quick, on the spot responses from you as a teacher to address the student's need to learn a particular concept or skill. Okay.
Thank you, Sir Kevin and Ma'am Marlene. You can still type in your questions, teachers. If
You're muted, Julie.
Sorry. Thank you, Ma'am Marlene and Sir Kevin. So keep your questions coming, participants, so that they can be answered. If I may add, Louis, to the ideas of Sir Kevin and Ma'am Marlene, since I was the one who was in charge in session 1. So, kung mapapansin niyo po, teachers, even though motivation questions are pre-planned, and most of our activities actually are pre-planned, it's already in our lesson plans. The motivation questions could elicit different responses from the learners. So there's no fixed answer sa motivation question, and that is one indicator for me to know if it's what do you call this? If it's formal or informal. And also, how do you use the data you've gathered, the data you've collected, the responses of the learners? If you use it again, just to repeat what our speakers already said, if you use it to make adjustments to the lesson, real-time adjustments to the lesson, then it would be classified as informal. But if you're going to collect them, take time to analyze them, and then make some changes to the subsequent lesson, then that would be formative assessment.
Thank you, Julie. So we're still waiting for some questions. So please type in your questions in the YouTube comment box. Since wala pang question, I got a question from our previous session. Is that okay? So let's try to answer the question from a teacher before. So here's the question. Good day. It's so good listening to speakers who can well articulate assessment that it makes me think that what we want to do can be readily achieved. However, when I try to apply this, I just become frustrated since I don't know how to start. What should I do? So who would like to answer? Ma'am Marlene, Kevin?
Sige, Kevin, you go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to answer this one. I guess first of all, based on session 1, I think it's quite clear already that some of the assessment methods that you teachers are doing are already assessment. So we are not restricted to giving, let's say, paper and pencil tests or paper and pencil quizzes. Or let's say a simple discussion or a simple uh let's say yes or no or thumbs up or thumbs down activities. Those are actually assessments already. So going back to your question, probably you've been doing or practicing you have assessment practices already, but you just don't know that it's already assessment. So how to start? Probably you have to I guess my advice is you have to always check your students. As I said earlier, yeah, assessment is a vital part of and it's intertwined with curriculum and instruction. So it's important that you know where your students are, what they can do, and what they already know. And to do that is you have to conduct assessments, whether it's formative or summative assessments, so that you'll know where they are and what they can do. You can start by a simple recitation. Probably that's a very simple. It doesn't involve much time. And if let's say you have a large class, big classes, then you can do some activities that, like say, a thumbs up, thumbs down activity, or agree or disagree activity, so that it will not take time for you to, let's say, check their individual answers. And in other words, you can determine whether they understood the lecture already or not. Ayun, Ma'am.
Okay, yeah. That's true. You have to connect, first sabi mo, ang tanong kasi, I don't know how to start. What should I do? Well, the prerequisite for you as a teacher is first know your students, know them in terms of what they already know based on your previous lessons, and then you do some strategies at the beginning. If you are already having a new lesson, there are many strategies. Yun na nga sinabi ni Teacher Carl, thumbs up, thumbs down. You can do some small group work just to find out to what extent they can work on an activity without grading them. Or you can do some anticipation guide. You have a series. You ask them to write questions about the topic that you will be taking up for that day. And then at the end of the class, you can ask them what they found out, or what answers could they give based on their own questions. So there are many strategies on how you can start, but the important thing is for you to know the type of students you have, the way to motivate them, and the way to interact with them in such manner that they can be very open to you, that they don't know this concept or this skill, and that they are open enough to ask you as a teacher. Of course, mahirap yan kasi marami kayong estudyante, but you can manage to look at certain number of students one day at a time. Okay. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Mo, Marlene, and Kevin. So we're still waiting for questions. So feel free to type in your questions in the YouTube comment box. So we'll wait for 1 minute or 2 minutes. Kung wala, close na namin. So, Julie, are you there?
Yes, I am here, Louie. So I just hope that not receiving your questions means that you understand the topic very well. So we will still wait for your questions, dear teachers. Feel free.
Sige, mukhang may papasok pa kaya. So, session 1 is really important because somehow it describes the entire assessment. So, overview kasi siya ng entire session natin, sessions 1 to 6. So, I hope you had a good grasp on that. Pero kung wala pa kayong good grasp on what is formal and informal formative assessment, don't worry, because the informal formative assessment will be discussed further at sessions 4 and 5. So ano siya we are trying to elaborate further the concepts that were introduced at session 1. So don't worry about it. Sige. So mukhang wala na, Julie.
Okay, sana naintindihan nilang mabuti yung topic, Louie. Thank you, Sir Kevin and Ma'am Marlene. So at this point, I would like to request Teacher Kevin to provide some highlights from this synchronous session.
Okay. So just to summarize what is covered in session one. So I hope that in session one you're able to recognize the important role of assessment in the teaching learning process, and also to determine whether an assessment is formative or summative based on its purpose, and also hopefully you're able to understand now the differences between formal and informal formative assessments. So indeed, assessment is very vital in the teaching and learning process, as it provides feedback to both teachers and students as well. And it should be primarily aimed at improving classroom instruction. So that's it, Julie.
Thank you, Teacher Kevin. Now, I think it's a good time to address some administrative issues such as accessing the links to Qualtrics and or playing the videos. Ideally, use personal computers so you can view the lecture videos and complete the activities more efficiently. A good internet connection is also required. You can still use your tablets or mobile phones, but make sure to have a stable internet connection. Most of the issues experienced are addressed by these two conditions.
Yes, Louis. So we found out po that there are common concerns about this, and here's how we can address them. Kung hindi niyo po ma-access ang links, please check your internet connection or use a different browser. If you are getting an error message while inputting any details like password and email address, please make sure to input the correct information, check internet connection, or use a different browser. Pakitry niyo pong i-refresh ang inyong browser o gumamit ng ibang device. Kung hindi naman po nagpe-play ang lecture videos, please check your internet connection or use a different browser. If any of your responses are not being accepted, please try addressing the error message or refreshing your browser. Again, madalas po ay device o internet connection related ang dahilan ng technical issues na inyong nararanasan. Kung kailangan niyo po ng tulong, please send a message to the Facebook group ACTRC Assessment Professional Development. Louis?
Before we close, here are some reminders for our next sessions. For those who have not answered or completed session 1, assessment and its purposes, you may still proceed with the training. We will be closing the Qualtrics link of session 1 on Tuesday, June 28, 8 a.m. Session 2, assessment planning, will be available on that same date, Tuesday, June 28, 8 a.m. We highly encourage you to not miss any session to maximize your possibilities for learning. Synchronous Session 2 will be held on Friday, July 1, 3 p.m. via YouTube Live. Julie?
Yes. So this ends the first synchronous session for this program. We hope that this has strengthened your learning and inspired you to look forward to the next asynchronous and synchronous sessions. We look forward to seeing you next time. Maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat po.